would have 51% of the pipeline of clinical development executing decentralized clinical trials. So I think that the therapeutic areas matter, but you need to be able to do those in a way that scales to the enterprise opportunity in the way that pharma is seeing this as a critical strategic driver of their clinical development methodology.
Thanks, Michelle. So it sounds like in a lot of ways, the COVID work, you're not ready to box up and put in storage yet, but you are, it seems, keen to refocus back on those other therapeutic areas that you were driving growth prior to the pandemic. Well, for our next question, this one I'm excited about because we have a very diverse group of leaders on the panel, two that are engaged more on the venture side for funding for their businesses at different stages really of in terms of series and rounds, one that's private equity backed, another that's in the public markets. And so for many of us that have been following, Rock Health reports in the last quarter, it was the lowest quarter for digital health fundraising since 2019. The NASDAQ is down 30% year to date. So there's clearly a changing environment, perhaps in terms of access to capital. How does that change how leaders are thinking about growth and internal investment? And maybe we'll start at the venture end of the panel. Michelle, do you want to start us off there?
Thanks, Craig. Well, you know, it's super interesting. I think when I take a step back and look at our journey at Medical, right? I'm a kind of an outsider to Silicon Valley. We grew and developed this company, created a category with very few resources. And we made incredible progress during very resource-constrained periods of the company. You know, then we got backed by Tiger and Blackstone, and we've raised, you know, a significant amount of venture capital. We did that at a phase where there was a tremendous amount of interest in this sector. So we were able to raise $300 million at the end of 2021. I think that what we see now is we want to, it's not growth at all costs, which I actually think is a positive thing because having operated the company at different phases from more resource constrained to cost of capital being at an all-time low, I actually think you build a better company in resource constrained times. I think about it like when I played college soccer. There's a reason you have 11 people on the field, not 13 people on the field. It's easy to think that additional resourcing is going to help you solve a hard problem, but the best way to solve a hard problem is understand what's needed to solve it. So I think that, yes, strategies have changed. I actually think they will make the company stronger, and these will be durable, sustainable companies that drive incredible profits. And you know, it is a different phase of the strategy, but I think actually it's a positive thing, as hard as it is, in terms of building a company that really endures.
Thanks, Michelle. Brett, does access to capital in today's environment shift any of your plans or strategy for DataCube?
Great question, and I completely agree. I think Michelle's right that it's not growth at all costs. So there's the concept that a lot of firms have, which is go big or go home. I like to think of it, they say now, is go big or go home within reason. So there's still a lot of money out there, a lot of capital, but they're not doing the silly money or the stupid money, as the Phillies general manager once said. They're doing reasonable investments, but it does change our strategy to make sure that we're using the money wisely, that we're, as you bring in experienced people who can roll their sleeves up and do things versus go out and get everyone in the industry, and then the next thing you know, you're having difficulty to grow the company. So profitability becomes a little more important than a typical growth company where it's just about growth.
Does that change strategy around new areas that maybe last or 2 years ago you thought will branch out into all these different areas? We have seemingly unlimited access to capital. Are you more focused on a core asset today than you might have been 2 years ago?
Absolutely. So when you think of it from an investor perspective, you're often trying to invest for the future and invest 2, 3, 4 years ahead. Right now, there's a lot more focus on do what you do well right now, and then either expand later or look to each other to partner. Let's not reinvent the wheel. I think the gentleman this morning said it best. Walk around and every booth says the same thing, does the same thing. Why don't we talk to each other, partner, collaborate, and that way we don't need to have the same amount of access to capital, but rather use it through collaborations.
Kim, Thread is in a different stage in terms of where their capital comes from, focus private equity, but the same concerns apply. It's still a constrained environment. Do you sense that access to capital may be changing some of the longer-term strategy or near-term strategy at Thread, and what is that starting to look like?
It's been interesting because, yes, we've definitely felt the same kind of constraints that you're seeing in the market. But I would say our board has been incredibly supportive of our future vision and where we're looking to go with our tech, which has been great. I think Thread has always been very good about having a very discrete roadmap of where they want to go. And we have always leveraged a lot on the partnering side. So we will continue to partner where we have better experts in the field that do it better than we do. But I think it's around the integration and the being able to move the data back and forth. And so a big focus for us right now is automating and making it as easy to partner with others to make it into a seamless environment so that we just become one with the clinical trial and not be seen as just DCT. I think that's kind of becoming like patient centricity was about 5 years ago. It's the same thing right now. It's like DCT, well, what does that actually really mean?
And Anthony, I'm sure that you're in an interesting environment now. It's a publicly traded company, just so that it's highly diversified. I'm sure there's a lot of different pressures in the company in today's economic environment. How does that change some of your strategy for growth right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're not raising capital in the same way, but a lot of the same constraints and evolutionary processes still apply to the things that we're thinking about in terms of R&D investment. And I was thinking about when Ronnie was talking, we are just in the craziest industry on earth, this industry. And you think about his comment about the booths all looking the same is true, and I get it. But none of those stories on those booths were there just a few years ago. DTRA wasn't there. No one was doing decentralized trials. We were just trying to wrap our heads around the first edges of that, like ePro and eConsent, right? So I think the way to sum up the last few years, in my view, is we got a big catalyst for change in COVID. It takes a catalyst in any industry, but especially in our industry, it takes a big catalyst to make this kind of change happen. And we threw a ton of money at a ton of great, cool new stuff, and we all went into growth mode, and we all built a lot of great products. And now we're kind of seeing a pulling back from that, right? Like how at some point you have to commercialize, you have to lean towards profitability, you have to let the monetization of all your R&D catch up a little bit. And that's where we're at. I think the investor community, whether we're talking about public investors buying stock in Dassault, or whether talking about private investors looking to re-up in the next series for many of these startups, there's a lot of great stuff that's been created, but because we're in the craziest industry on earth, we still have to wrestle with how do we get adoption, how do we get steady teams to do this, what's the right site model, how do you pick a technology, how do you switch technologies a few times until you get something that works, how do you go from your innovation team to actually getting your steady teams to adopt, and so on and so on. So we're on maybe a little bit of a downturn in the growth part of the model. But the good news is we've created a ton of new innovation, a whole bunch of new booths with new slogans, and I think a real no going back mentality, Craig, that you kickstarted and that I think has really changed the way we think about clinical research forever.
And a downturn in growth, not that growth is going backward, but it sounds like a refocus. So growth will still happen, not to the extent that it had, but with eyes on this theme of execution and stabilizing that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're a startup, you think about growth, right? Because someone else is giving you money all the time. But at some point, you've got to be able to start turning a profit on the growth. You can't run a business on growth alone. It doesn't matter what size business. I can't run a business on growth alone. We have to make revenue because we're not raising money from investors. We have to do our R&D with revenue. So we generate revenue. Other folks on the stage here are raising money, but there's a relationship, sometimes a challenging one, between growth and profitability, and we are seeing a swing away from growth, at least in this moment, but only because we've done nothing but growth for the last couple of years.
And I think what's an important clarifying point there is, I think what Anthony's saying is that what we see is tremendous growth in the DCT category, I think when we're talking about the companies, the investors are looking for beyond growth, they're looking for a path to profitability. And I think what is interesting is because of the growth of the DCT area and the scale that pharma is now, executing on DCT, I think that initial growth investment, what we're seeing, does translate to high quality revenue that is sustainable and drives profitability for companies. And I do think that is an industry, something we should be really proud of, because that's what makes something enduring from an innovation perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And actually, that's a great segue as we think about growth and profitability. And I'd be curious on your perspectives as to whether there's any truth to the reports of investors expecting that shifting focus from growth to profitability, and how that really might be good for long-term sustainability of DCTs. And some of the thoughts that at least that come to my mind around this is thinking through, are we really looking at partnering with other experts that might already offer existing technologies or platforms or services? Or is this something that you really want to build in-house and go deeper? Maybe Michelle, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I really see the current market is as hard as it is because it's just a big change in the thinking. I think it's very positive. And the reason is, for us, for example, we know what the market wants. And in fact, the best thing we can do is just hyper-focus on doing that with such excellence and scalability that every molecule in development could harness a technology like this, as we've shown with the Tufts data, a 13x return on investment for a phase 3 trial. So I think one of the silver linings of the current situation is, the last couple of years, we were able to hone the product market fit, and now it's about scalability and focus. So I think the timing to shift from hey, let's make many bets in parallel to let's do this one thing really well, I think the timing is right to do that, and it's also what the industry needs. So I think that it's a positive, and to your point, we partnered with CVS. They do things, maybe if we had all the money in the world, we would say, hey, let's invest more in that direction, but it makes sense for us to partner in core areas. But I think that the focus on doing DCT, the technology backbone, scalable with excellence across therapeutic areas, we know what that solution looks like. And I think all of us are working to really get that at scale into the market.
I completely agree there. I think that, one thing not to forget is the investors are saying that the market is growing significantly, but it's growing with so many choices out there that we are all looking for the path to profitability. So from an investor perspective, it's very different to have a company say, we need this money to be sustained, versus here's an investment we can make to have the next growth. So getting the profitability is so important, and whether that's through the buy or build scenario is what we're all going through. I think if you step back years ago, we all have said, let's just keep building everything. Let's go as quick as we can. And we look around at folks out here and say, why would I build that if you have that already? Why would I build it if you have that already? Why can't we just work together for that? So, but we use the same terminology, the path to profitability, so that you're investing because you have an opportunity, not because you need to keep the lights on.
Right, and that also leads to a path of acceleration at that point too.
There is, but I think the perspective too is going from crazy growth. So it's not that we're not growing. We are growing. We're growing double digits. The market's exploding in this area. It's just not crazy growth. And so in a crazy growth setting, there's a lot of fat that's put into your organizations because you just need people now to do it now. It's not thoughtful, it's not efficient, and it's not sustainable. So I think what we're starting to see now is we're still in a growth market, and it's a nice growth market. It's just we're taking the step back to start cutting the fat and making sure that we're efficient, we're effective, and we're sustainable for the future, and we're building towards what the next thing is going to be, because there's always something new coming down. And whether that's partnering or whether it's building, I think the point being here, it's about how to connect it, right? At some point, you have to get the data out. And if you look at the way trials are set today, there may be 8 to 10 vendors on one study, and you have to merge all that data. You need to integrate that data, and I think that becomes the focus now as we start to move into the next phase, is how do you integrate and get the data out? Because we can all get it in.
Anthony, I don't know if you have a perspective on this when you're in a different place. You're a profitable company that we can all follow online every quarter. But
Can't
you've also
hide.
been but you've been an entrepreneur building up companies yourself.
I was actually just thinking about that, I think, and I love your point about the fat, and in many cases, the market will cut the fat, right? The market is gonna tell us what works and what doesn't work, what they wanna buy, what can be implemented, what patients find useful, what actually moves the needle on things like retention and recruitment and quality of data and speed and all of that. So, and Craig, I was thinking about when we ran the remote trial and we were all excited about virtual studies, but it turned out that e-consent was the thing that stuck back in those days. And the market told us in no uncertain terms, it's too soon for virtual trials, as we called them back then, or we're not gonna do that, but we are excited about e-consent. So, a lot of what we're gonna see here over the next few years is pivoting, doubling down on the stuff that works, looking for the things that can be commercialized on a broad scale, and the things that move the needle, and then the fat will come off and the profitability will start to happen.
So in the course of trimming the fat, do we risk losing some of the innovative edges around this core? Are we going to risk being so focused on our core assets of whether it's e-consent, video, e-COA, those core elements of DCT? Are we going to lose the ability to invest in some of those edge cases?
Is that for me?
Sure. Trim the fat.
No, I think the reason that growth is part of the equation is that we want to push that envelope. And again, I'll go back to Ronnie's talk. Like, he wants us to go faster and to do more and to push that boundary of innovation. And if you talk to any patient advocate or a patient who's in a trial or has been in trials before, they're going to tell you, I don't want to hear stories about how long it took for you to get your protocol done and through the IRBs and this and that and contracting and whatever. They just want the study to start and they want to get dosed. So we have to continue pushing the innovation envelope, and investors are very excited about this market because they want to see us do that. But the history of innovation in a capitalist market is investors throw a lot of money at growth. And at some point, growth is supposed to lead to market share. Market share is supposed to lead to profitability. You double down on the stuff that works, you trim the fat, and you have a model that can turn itself over. And I think I'm not gonna say it's a correction, but we have seen a ton of innovation in the last couple of years. We can stay innovative while still focusing on the things that have some sort of trajectory into operationalization.
I also think that, when I look at the next phase of innovation, it's harnessing the scale that we now have. So, when you look at the advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning, specifically machine learning and automation, we will seize that benefit by doing things reproducibly and at scale. So I actually think that the current focus is what unlocks the next era of value that is the hyper-growth value. Once you've done 50 psoriasis studies with a certain set of insights around patient retention, site performance, automating that protocol build, it takes a certain scale to unlock the next era of innovation, which I think is exactly where we're kind of focused right now. And that will be a level of value that we haven't seen provided before from new technology leverage like machine learning. So I think it's actually very much fueling growth, and it's a next era of growth that will be extraordinary in the leverage it can provide.
Kim?
I think it's about adoption though as well. What we've seen is a lot of piloting, right? Everybody wants to dip their toe in the water, but nobody jumps in. And I think where the innovation is going to come from is the adoption as pharma just embeds it as part of their DNA in how they conduct their trials. So it's no longer decentral trials, it's just clinical trials, leveraging the most efficient and effective way to gather the data directly from the patient. So I think it's around adoption. I think it's around design. We have to get out of let's create a trial like we've always created and then say, hey, we're going to decentralize that. Not effective, doesn't really work. And I think, especially from the morning sessions, most important is thinking about the patient. And I think that's where innovation is going to come, is how do you make trials more accessible to patients worldwide? How do you simplify it? How do you decrease the burden and still allow that flexibility and agility for that patient to have a normal life? You don't want them to come into a trial and not be the be-all, end-all of what they do every day. They have their life to lead. You just want it to be a part of what they do, and I think that's truly where the innovation is going to come from.
Just to add to that, I think what we're seeing is less crazy innovation. We have to say we're seeing innovation with a safe pair of hands. So most innovation that we're seeing are things that we talk to our kids about, and they're like, how is that innovative? We've been doing that for the last 10 years. But we're putting it in this industry for the first time. But with all the experts around the industry in this room, we're making sure that we're innovating, but we're not being disrespectful to a safe clinical trial. We're still going to make sure that we understand you still have to go through regulatory, you have to do these things for patient safety, but you can do it in a different way, just not crazy innovation. I think that's what I'm seeing less of.
Steph, do you want to take us home with one last one?
I was going to say, with all of this in mind, I'd be curious your perspective as to how organizations like DTRA can really help you continue that growth and the path and this movement that we're experiencing today. Maybe Brett?
Sure. So whether through this forum, in this session here, or the various DTRA networking opportunities we have, the great thing about DTRA is sharing stories of one another. Sharing, whether it's what we're seeing in our businesses with employees and the stress and the anxiety, what we're seeing as we're working with different sponsors, how to move things together. So sometimes it's collaborating, but more often it's just about sharing stories and learning from each other. What are you going through? How do you overcome that obstacle to change the way that someone's thinking? For every company you're talking to, there might be 8 of 9 people say, this is great, we're going to move forward, and there's one detractor. How do we work around those detractors?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that Anthony said it so well when we said, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, DTRA didn't even exist. And I think that what's incredible about this community is look at what we have done. Look at how things have changed. And I'm so proud of the TUFS data that shows that this has a big impact. It's technology leveraged to solve one of the hardest problems in the world, clinical development. It's still a long way to go. So I love, and I think that the DTRA community is so important for the same reasons that Brett said. Like, we've driven incredible change. How do we keep driving more change to bring the value that patients need in receiving these therapies? How do we do that faster? How do we do it at lower cost? I think this is a community of innovators and change makers. We're solving hard problems, and we've come a long way, but we have even farther to go.
Yeah, I think it's also about the pooled learning and just common communication. I think, we're starting to talk the same language, and when you start merging tech with clinical, it doesn't always work real well. If you guys remember, I'm going to age myself, but back in the paper DCT days, when you had a query come out and your data person's asking for some field name and you have to send it off to a physician and you're like, I don't even know what that is. How is a doctor going to understand what that is? I think, when you look at how far we've come, I think it's because we're starting to say the same things. We're starting to be able to merge the tech speak with clinical and just embed it in the way that everybody's starting to understand.
So if we can help to normalize some best practices, how does that then help you in achieving profitability, sustainability for your business? Anthony, last word?
Yeah, I think, as we've all said, DTRA has got to have the fastest growth from scratch of any industry organization ever. Again, I think there was a catalyst that was the right timing for us all to come together in this organization. And I think it's a fantastic place to set standards. The working groups that are established here are the right ones. They're making great progress. And I think that maybe the next stage of this, when we look into next year, is how do we foster a little bit more cross-consortium collaboration? Because there's a lot of work around decentralized trials happening at SCDM and SCRS and ASCO and ACRO and so on. And I think maybe the next evolution of this, kind of getting the industry to coalesce around decentralized models, is pulling some of those efforts together and looking at it holistically from an industry standpoint.
That's a great point. We have representatives here from SCRS, ATA, ACRO, and a few other groups, and absolutely are driving that type of cross-collaboration. We see it right now even with the glossary from DTRA, and the efforts to potentially harmonize that with some others. A spot-on point. Well, listen, the sustainability of this ecosystem relies on the sustainability of the work that you are doing. So I really appreciate Michelle, Brett, Anthony, Kim, all of you sharing some time here today. And of course, Steph, thanks for joining us. Please join me in thanking this panel.